Hey, this is Lori Lineky. This is your final podcast for ethics this year, and this week's topic is ethical decision-making models. Your lecture objectives: by the end of the lecture, you should be able to independently discuss characteristics of ethical decision-making models commonly used in physical therapy practice, explain the process of arriving at an ethical decision using current research in relation to physical therapy practice, and correctly apply ethical decision-making models to various clinical scenarios across the physical therapy continuum. Lecture objective 3 will continue somewhat into next week. All right, there's two ethical decision-making models we're going to talk about today, the focal and the RIPS. Most of today will be focused on the RIPS model. There are numerous models that you can use for ethical decision-making, and many apply to different fields of study. The RIPS model was developed to address shortcomings in other models, but remember though that with any model there will be some weaknesses. All right, the focal model: facts, options, consequences, actions, and lessons learned. So let's start with facts. What's the relevant information? Who's involved? Who's affected? What do you know? What do you not know? So you need to gain more facts. We've talked about this several times so far in other discussions related to ethics. Options. What are your options? You need to look at the act, the outcome, and look at yourself and see where your decision making based on of the options is coming from. Consequences. You need to project the consequences of each option and test ethical principles related to those consequences. Action. After you weigh the options, select the best good or the least bad action and take action accordingly. And then lessons learned. Extract the most good out of your choice, reflect on the situation, consider hindsight, and work to prevent this from occurring again. You don't want to have a recurrence of a similar dilemma. All right, now we're going to talk about the RIPS model. And what are the components of this model? It's the realm, the individual process, and the situation. So this model was developed to take into account organization and societal issues. Other models often just look at the decision, but this model helps us take a step-by-step approach and kind of walk all the way around the problem before we complete our analysis and make a decision. Right, within the RIPS model, we talk about the realm, the individual process, and the situation. When you're looking at the realm, you want to consider, is this an individual problem? Are you concerned with the good of a patient or client, or the rights, duties, and obligations of an individual? This is often the least complex since it is dealing with behaviors related to an individual. It could be organizational or institutional. This is concerned with the good of organizations and focuses on structures and systems that facilitate organizational or institutional goals. And finally, societal. This is where we look at a situation that affects the common good and can often be the most complex realm. Realize that most situations have conflicts that go beyond one realm, but you need to find the most important one and be able to identify it within an individual, organizational, or societal realm. The individual process. This looks at moral behavior and what the situation requires of the individuals. Do you need to have moral sensitivity? So that's the first individual process, where this is recognizing, interpreting, and framing the ethical situation. Do you need to make a moral judgment? So the decision on right versus wrong. When you're talking about moral motivation, this is when there's a priority of ethical values over values such as self-interest or financial gains. So if you're making a decision and you have poor moral motivation, you may not do what's right for the entire situation, but you may be doing something that is based only on your self-interest. And then moral courage. This is when you have difficulty implementing the chosen ethical action. So having moral courage means that you make the action that you have determined. You develop a plan and you persevere even in the face of barriers. You need to prioritize your values and demonstrate courage. Okay, once you've determined the individual process, it's time to look at the situation. And realize not all situations have a definite right or a definite wrong, and that's why we have to assess them better. So is the situation an issue or a problem? This is where important values are present that may be challenged. Is it a dilemma? And this is where two alternative courses of action may be taken and both fulfill an important duty, but you're unable to fulfill both obligations. So in other words, you have two choices. Both may be right. So you have a right versus right choice, and that's where the dilemma comes in. Next is distress. You know the right course of action, but you're either not authorized to perform the action or not empowered to perform it. Temptation. This involves a choice between right and wrong. Sometimes you may benefit from doing the wrong thing, so you need to be able to still behave ethically even when faced with temptation. And the last one is silence, where ethical values are challenged but no one's speaking out about the action. In most situations, there can be issues, dilemmas, distress, temptation, and silence. So not all situations only have one of these problems, but you need to find the most common thread or the most common situation present to be able to identify it. All right, within this RIPS model, there are 4 steps to decision making: recognizing and define, reflecting, deciding, and then implementing, evaluating, and reassessing. And in step 1, recognize and define ethical issues. This is when you do a quick screen of the issue. You examine the case and analyze the realm, the process, and the situation, like we talked about before. You must have all the relevant facts and information. It helps to direct further ethical analysis. And sometimes there's conflicting ethical principles, values, and virtues, and you need to decide and define these conflicting values. All right, step 2 is reflect. You need to reflect upon and interpret the information that you've gathered in step 1. So what are the relevant facts, and how do those facts relate to the information? Who are the stakeholders? What are the possible consequences of a decision? What are the relevant laws, duties, obligations, and ethical principles? And what are the professional resources that are available to help? Within this step, there's some right versus wrong tests. All right. When you're making a decision, you can think of these to determine if your decision is a good one. So the legal test: is it legal or illegal to do what is occurring in that situation? The stench test: does it just feel wrong? Okay, so not, does the action make you uncomfortable? It just doesn't feel right. Front page test: if your behavior was placed on the front page of the paper, would it be applauded or would it be something that you would be ashamed of? The mom test: if you called your mom and told her, the situation and what was going on, would your mother feel proud, or would she, or would this be something you would prefer that your mother didn't know about? And then the code of ethics: does the code prohibit or discourage that behavior? All right, so after you've gone through all that, you need to decide the right thing to do, and that's step 3. You got to come up with a resolution to the dilemma. Don't forget your ethical theories and how they can come to play to help you to make a decision. There are some things you need to think of when making the decision. So the rule: follow the laws, the duties, and the principles that are in place. You may not be able to take context of a decision into account and who determines the most important duties and rules. So you need to understand the legalities of all that is involved. The ends: determine the outcome and the good or bad for stakeholders. So you need to know whose interest you should be considering when you're determining the consequences of good or bad. You can't always protect the rights and duties of every individual. And then care: resolve according to care for others. If you're unclear what action this approach would recommend, you may be going on emotions. And so you should have thought and care for other people, but you need to make sure that your decisions are soundly based. All right, and finally, step 4, implement, evaluate, and reassess. You need to implement the decision, and following this, you evaluate and reassess based on the outcomes of that action. This leads to personal growth and professional growth. You also can think about what new situations came about because of your decision. And here's some practical tips for ethics and ethical decision making. Keep current. You can continue to take classes on ethics, and the more you have to deal with ethical situations, the better you're going to be at it. Review the laws. You will have to practice under a state practice act no matter where you go. Each state practice act is different. For example, I've lived in states where physical therapist assistants cannot perform wound debridement, but here in North Carolina they can. I've worked in states where you can perform spinal manipulation. In North Carolina, you can perform it, but you need a specific order from a physician. Same thing about dry needling. Some states don't allow it. And so make sure that you know your laws of your state practice act. It surprises me how many PTs continue to not have a clue about the North Carolina Practice Act, even though they're practicing in North Carolina. Discuss and debate policies. You will learn a lot from hearing points of views opposite of yours. And so don't shy away from having these intellectual discussions and debates about ethical scenarios. Be active in organizations and associations. The American Physical Therapy Association and the North Carolina Physical Therapy Association both have great resources to help with ethical decision making. And be mindful. Understand all parties involved and make sound, well thought out, and relevant decisions. So in summary, there's many models available to use for ethical decision making, but the RIPS model aids in addressing limitations that other ethical models have. The RIPS model allows you to approach a situation systematically and step by step. But no matter what model you use, you have to reflect on the outcome and reassess for any possible negative outcomes or negative effects. And here's the references. Thank you.